Unabashed.
The most unpredictable.
Becomes a headline.
The most volatile.
Outrageous behavior.
Unsubstantiated narratives. A battle of personalities.
Welcome to Grand Tamasha, a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. I'm your host, Milan. For more than 15 years, the scholar Mukulika Banerjee has been deeply embedded in the social and political life of two villages in the state of West Bengal, studying developments there both during elections and between them. Her new book, Cultivating Democracy, Politics and Citizenship in Agrarian India, is a deeply researched study of Indian democracy that shows how agrarian life creates both the values of citizenship and active engagement that are essential for the cultivation of democracy. Mukulika is an associate professor in social anthropology at the London School of Economics. She joins me today on Zoom from London. Good to have you on the show.
Thank you, Milan. Delighted to be here.
So there's a lot to talk about in your book, but I want to start with something that comes up in the very first chapter. You note while, of course, this is a book that's about the study of democracy, it's equally, or perhaps even more so, the study of a republic. So as someone who is a political scientist and thinks about political science, I have to admit that I don't think as much as I probably should about the significance of India's status as a quote-unquote republic per se. I think probably most of our listeners also tend to focus more on India's democratic credentials. Why do you think this distinction is so noteworthy, and why do you bring it up right at the top of your book?
Well, Milan, if you thought this was important and picked it up as something that had been missing in the literature, then I'm delighted, because that's exactly what I wanted my book to achieve. As we know, India is described not just as a democracy in its constitution, it is a democratic republic. And I was very struck that in all this, terrific writing on Indian democracy that we have from a variety of disciplines, we don't have really very much theorizing about the nature of the republic. And it's important because when one goes back to those Constitutional Assembly debates, there was, in fact, quite a debate over the choice of words. Right? So India was initially described as a sovereign, independent republic. And the word republic there was doing the work of both democracy and non-monarchy and so on. And it was really B.R. Ambedkar, who we know as somebody who was both trained in law and other disciplines, was very particular as the chair of the drafting committee that the words that were used were both democracy and republic. And this struck me as interesting and worth probing. And when one does, you realize that what is being said there by the insistence of these two words is that the word democracy is really describing the nature of the relationship between citizen and state. It is the vertical relationship. It's the political democracy. It's the institutional democracy of elections and representation. Whereas the word republic is really about the relationship between citizen and citizen. It is the horizontal relationship. The word there is fraternity to describe that relationship. Now, when one thinks about how democracy works in any society, elections come along periodically, but life obviously continues in between elections. And a society doesn't stop being a democracy when there is no election. So what happens to democratic culture? And how is democratic culture produced? And I would argue that really, unless you have the values denoted by that word republic, of republicanism, of active citizenship, of holding elected representatives to account, of participation, of vigilance, these are the values associated with the republic, and these are just as important. And I would go as far as to say that really without robust values of the republic, you cannot have democracy.
So you mentioned B.R. Ambedkar just now, and I want to come back to him. Obviously, he's a central figure, but in more ways than one. The main thesis of the book, if I really had to boil it down, is that the social imaginaries of agrarian life generate values that share an affinity with and provide a resource for Republican democratic practice in India. And that's why your book's title is so clever, right? Cultivating Democracy. But I'm struck by your emphasis on rural agrarian life, because no less a figure than Ambedkar himself urged his contemporaries that India's salvation would come in the form of urbanization, of cities, of movement away from villages. Because, as he famously recalled, villages were dens of localism, of caste, of hierarchy, of backwardness. What do you think Ambedkar missed?
I think he missed the lived reality and the potential of rural life. And Ambedkar wasn't alone. In fact, Ambedkar and Nehru disagreed on much else, but on this they were in complete agreement on the one hand. And on the other were the pluralists, people like Gandhi, people like Harold Lasky, people like Radhakamal Mukherjee, Beni Prasad, who uh, thought that there was a capacity for uh, active participation, of self governance that could come out of the rural, that could come out of the village. But unfortunately, it's that image of the village as a sink of localism and vice that is stuck. And it is exactly the narrative of modernity. It is the narrative of the Lewis turning point, that somehow the agrarian labor force is going to exit agriculture. The sign of progress is to exit it, to urbanize, to industrialize, and that somehow this teleological path has to be followed by all nations. Now, India is clearly not, doesn't fit that description at all. It remains more than 60% rural. There is a lot happening in the rural. And yes, there is flight from the rural for in search of work and employment and opportunity in the urban. But that is because there is no uh, opportunities being created in the rural. There's nothing intrinsic about the rural that does. And it was very interesting that while this image of rural India has stuck as somehow backward, it was a challenge, therefore, as an anthropologist, therefore, to really engage with that society. I've been, as you said, this particular book's research covers a 15-year period, but really, it's my research home. I've been going back to it since 1998 every single year. And one knows it intimately well, and you see what the uh, huge drawbacks are, of course, of living in the rural, but also what the potentialities are. And I dare say, with huge admiration and respect for Dr. Ambedkar, that he probably didn't know this. He left rural life at a very young age in very violent and difficult circumstances of extreme ostracization. And you can understand why he was dismissive of the rural as ridden by caste prejudice and violence of different kinds. But any familiarity with the rural in a longer term, it is possible to argue against that very static negative picture of it.
So you note early on that, most Indians and people who follow India have a pretty kind of stereotypical idea of what agrarian life looks like, right? It's a life that's dominated by a male farmer who's toiling in the fields, who lives in a village, cultivates crops on his own land. But you note that this popular conception is actually very restrictive and highly misleading. How so?
Well, one of the biggest problems with contemporary India is that we don't know how many farmers there are. There is no census that captures that figure. So you see journalists and scholars writing about this, that the figure that is arrived at about how many people actually do any farming is a whole set of extrapolations from other things, size of land holdings, and other such indicators. And as we know, farming as an activity is the proportion of people who farm land that they actually own is tiny. There are lots of sharecroppers, there's lots of tenancy farming, and then there are a whole set of aggregate, activities such as sericulture and forest foraging. There's lots of different things that get um, counted under the activities of farming. And women are very dominant um, in that activity and entirely invisible. So they're not counted, and therefore development economists and anthropologists and others have to excavate that story of farming and detach it from this very male solitary activity. In fact, the say transplantation or planting of seeds or harvesting are female activities, and they're collaborative and they're cooperative activities. So that picture of farming needs to change.
Just to pick up on this, Mukulika, some of the ongoing work we've been doing in 4 states in North India, you see that many women themselves don't classify as employment the work that they're doing on their own fields or tending to livestock, right? Because it is somehow in their own heads, even, not to mention maybe other members of their family, embedded or classified as kind of, domestic activities, right? Domestic duties, when in fact it is a major part of the employment picture in the household.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, as you know, one of the 4 events in the book is of animal sacrifice. And in that chapter, I discuss, in fact, that rural life of the kind that I'm describing in the book is quite typical of large parts of India, where there is what you would call a human animal economy. And that humans and animals share the same space. Livestock is managed within the household, within the homestead. And there is a relationship of intimacy between animals and humans. And thereby, all the care, the preparation of fodder, the putting out to pasture, the maintenance of health of livestock, all of these things, which is work and labor, is classified, as you say, as part of household activities. So there is, this is, and without these activities, you would not have the agrarian, you wouldn't have rural India.
The book draws on research you did between 1998 and 2013 in 2 villages in West Bengal. You called them in the book Madanpur and Chishti. Paint us a picture, if you might, of these 2 villages. Why did you decide to tell a very large macro story of Indian democracy through the lens of 2 relatively small, obscure villages in the eastern state of Bengal?
Well, it started macro, then went very micro to these villages, and it's come back to the macro. So the first macro was the Lokniti survey of 1998, where they discovered their major top line finding was that rural, low caste, female India voted more enthusiastically and in higher numbers than, say, upper caste male urban voters. I found this a fascinating finding, and the only way to answer why this was the case was to really probe this ethnographically. And so I needed to find somewhere that displayed those characteristics that I wanted to find out the causes for. And so I visited all the different sites that the Lokniti CSDS survey had covered in West Bengal and came across these 2 cities, these 2 villages. So when I got there, and the villages actually haven't changed that much since 1998. I was there last in September 2019, so just a few months before the pandemic hit, and they are really quite poor, modest villages. You have a combination of mud and thatch houses and some 2-story pakka houses built of concrete and brick. There's lots of anyone who can keep livestock did, if they could, and everything from cattle to goats to chicken. And there were the demography was mostly Muslim and Hindu low caste, right? So you got all 4 castes of Muslims, and Muslims have castes in India. So the Sayyids, the Sheikhs, Mughals, and the Pathans, all 4 castes. And there were Domes and Bagdis, who are also classified as scheduled castes in India, so really low Hindu castes. And both villages had a combination of all these castes, voter turnout in these villages was over 90%. And adult illiteracy was pretty high when I started the work. It's lessened over the years. I mean, I've seen, at least one generation come through where now a lot of the parents are literate, at least if not fully educated. And these villages, therefore, were exactly the kind of society that I wanted to understand. That you're a farming community, paddy was the dominant crop. By this point, of course, high-yielding varieties had become very popular in West Bengal because of the Green Revolution. So 2 paddy crops were cultivated, and in between a wheat crop as well. So when I first started, there was a lot of farming, and over the years, one big change that I've observed is that um, the groundwater has dropped so much because especially high-yielding varieties require so much irrigation that they're very expensive crops as well. The yields are much higher than the traditional paddy, but they also require a lot of water. And many years it's getting very difficult to pull up that much groundwater to irrigate the crops. The other one is monsoon fed and so on. So the story of paddy has been a very interesting story of change in these villages as well. Islam story has changed. The political story has changed because, of course, the left front was at its absolute heyday, at peak of its hegemony in 1998. By 2013, I end the book in 2013 because its ouster is complete with Trinamool Congress winning the panchayat elections. So these 3 big changes of paddy, Islam, and politics happen. But the one thing that remains constant is the voter turnout and people's commitment to participation.
Let me try and bring these 2 things together, because the annual paddy harvest that you describe in the book is in some sense this great leveling mechanism in society, right? And here I was reminded of the work that Amit Ahuja and Pradeep Chibber, 2 political scientists, have done, who ask, why it is that the poor vote in India in such great numbers. And part of their answer has to do with the fact that, they're exercising their rights during a window of time when they share exactly the same rights as everyone else, regardless of their caste, creed, or station in life. So what is it about the harvest time that similarly inculcates or creates such an egalitarian spirit that allows, whatever deep-seated divisions you might have in society to temporarily take a back seat?
Let me first say, Milan, that I think my argument of sacred elections, of elections providing an egalitarian levels playing field, probably predates Ahuja and Chibber's piece. Mine was published in 2007 when I proposed this thesis and said that it is precisely for this reason that elections are considered sacrosanct. Not because people feel not because people are forced to vote. It's not compulsory in India, as we know, to vote, but because it was so important, especially if you were at the bottom of the social hierarchy, to experience that moment of social leveling, as you said. Now,
and just to interject, we'll link to this on the show notes. You have an excellent article. I believe it's called "Elections as Communitas," which helps to crystallize some of these arguments.
That's right. And in fact, you've picked on exactly what is similar between the harvest and the election. And that is why I see them as sort of analogies in many ways. Because the harvest, even though everything to do with land and agriculture is so unequal, it is based on who owns land, who has money for capital outlay, who's having to sell their labor, various kinds of labor arrangements. So the whole process of farming and agriculture is hierarchical. And yet, when you get to the few days in which you have to bring in a harvest, several things are upturned. First, there is no question of the importance of the individual here. It is by nature a collective activity. So a single person can never bring in a harvest from a field. You need a group of people to collaborate, to cooperate, to bring this together. Secondly, in the case of West Bengal, it is very important what happened with the land reforms is because land was redistributed unequally in West Bengal, but in certainly where I was doing research, it did happen. And so you get the lower sheikhs, the sharecroppers, with certain permanent tenancy, but also with much greater agricultural knowledge. So you have, even though the Sayyids, the upper caste Sayyids, are officially the owners of land, they are subservient to the sheikhs and others who know how to manage agricultural work, how to manage the labor, what kind of sequencing of tasks need to be done, etc. And as I show, everybody has to pull together. So for those few days, very much like the polling station, inequalities have to be suppressed. You have to create an altered sociality in which the task at hand, pulling together, cooperation, is more important than division and inequality. And so the harvest then creates this almost, as I say, a transcendent moment of what anthropologists would call it's a social drama, where the normal structures of everyday life are upturned into this liminal communitas of egalitarian cooperation. And that is the event of the harvest.
Hey, Grand Tamasha listeners. Thanks for listening to the podcast. Putting this show together each week is a labor of love, but it takes a lot of work to put out a great show every week. If you'd like to support the work we do at Grand Tamasha, please visit ceip.org/donate. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or on your favorite podcasting platform, so you'll be the first to know when a new episode rolls out. So I wanted to kind of segue to ask you about the social drama at the heart of elections. And I think maybe before we get into that, maybe I'll just ask you to give our listeners some context by introducing us to a central character, in a way, in the book called the Comrade. Who was the Comrade, and why was this person so significant in this area that you studied?
Okay, so the left front in India, in West Bengal, ruled. West Bengal was in power from 1977 to 2011. 34 years of a coalition of left and communist parties in power through elections. It hasn't happened anywhere else in the world this long. And the reason they were able to do this is because they had a capillary network. They had the Communist Party of India, Marxist, which was the dominant political force there. But the Communist Party of India, Marxist, worked in West Bengal through a capillary network of comrades like the one in my village, where practically in every other village you had a comrade like this. So vertically, they were linked to the party organization. And below them and horizontally, they were linked to other comrades in other villages. And each of them then controlled the population that they were sort of in charge of within their village. These comrades over a 34-year period became entirely hegemonic, of the kind that has been described by Bhattacharya as party society. The Communist Party of India, Marxist, becomes so embedded in every aspect of social life that it is indistinguishable from society itself. And so I'm able to observe this very minutely because I knew the comrade well and I knew everybody in the village very well. And initially, of course, people were so terrified. And this, it's worth remembering this, that when I first started the research, people were absolutely petrified of saying anything critical of the left front government, because part of what the comrade also did was to make sure that he stamped out any opposition, any criticism of any sort. So people never said anything. But it was as I won trust with people over the decades that I began to hear the stories of just how he managed to control people. On the other side, he also made available various kinds of government schemes for loans and employment opportunities, subsidies for agriculture. So he was seen to be the absolutely essential go between the village and the party, the village and the state, without whom life could not exist. And during the elections, therefore, the comrade's job was to deliver the votes. I mean, it was then obvious that people felt he was so important and so terrified of him that they felt they had to vote for the left front. Now, the slight subplot to this, which I find particularly fascinating, is that despite this very strong hegemonic hold, when you break down the vote shares of the different political parties, even during those absolutely dominant years of the left front, you find the opposition Congress party getting about 40% vote share, which is astonishing because it just goes to show, when you talk about democracy, it's not always reflected in the outcome of elections. You might say, oh, this was a one-party dominance. But the very fact that people are able to keep alive the idea of political opposition, which is so hard, at the heart of the idea of democratic politics, is very striking to me.
I mean, even we forget sometimes at the national level that the Congress Party never won 50% or more of the national vote share, right? Even though it was so dominant because of the fragmentation of the opposition and other shortcomings. But it's a useful reminder when we talk about partisan competition. I want to come to this culmination in some sense in the 2013 Bengal Panchayat elections. In reaction in part to the excesses of the comrade, ordinary citizens, and you document this, have learned the art of active citizenship, how to build alliances, how to make compromises, how to act collectively. The Trinamool Congress of Mamata Banerjee oust the CPIM. And this is a big deal for obvious reasons, after so many decades. But you sort of end on a more pessimistic note, right? Kind of insinuating that the residents may have traded sort of one illiberal or authoritarian equilibrium for another. And I'm curious if you could sort of talk to us about how things morphed from this one space dominated by the left to another space, but which has some of the same characteristics, even if the political labeling has changed.
Yes, I mean, there is a common saying in Bengal, as indeed elsewhere in India, that that politics in itself is dirty. And when they say that, they're talking about the politics of politicians. It's not what they do as voters, but what politicians do. And in that, they're pretty damning. All politicians ultimately are the same. In Bengal, the left front's modus operandi, in fact, has remained. It's been the legacy of communist politics in a sense. The absolute ubiquity of violence, for instance, of shutting down of opposition. These things have continued into Trinamool years. The changing of the political party does not necessarily change the style of governance. And so, therefore, it is almost when Trinamool Congress came to power in 2013, I quote the young man who brought them to power in the village as saying, oh, it's our turn now. And this, my message of wanting to just do exactly as was done to them, is the absolute curse of democratic politics of this kind. Having said that, I think it's very interesting that since 2013 in Bengal, what has happened is also so interesting because the Trinamool took on this mighty communist government and managed to oust them, but then has had to face such a huge challenge from the biggest political party in India, the BJP. And here, the idea that you can get hegemonic parties with might and muscle and money to come in, and how do you deal with it and how do you mount an opposition to it is something that people are at least familiar with.
I want to go back to the start of the book where you have this incredibly striking line in your preface where you note the following, quote, "In hindsight, it seems to be a privilege to have studied democracy while it still existed in India," end quote. And of course, there you are clearly referring to broad structural transformations in Indian democracy at a macro level. We had Christoph Jaffrelot on the show a few weeks ago who spoke about some of those trends. But after rereading the book a second time this weekend, it struck me that this observation could refer equally to politics in India's states, right? Which are often just as illiberal and authoritarian as what we might see nationwide. Do you agree with that?
Yes, I don't think this party or that necessarily ushers in a more democratic political democracy. The institutional framework of democracy is not necessarily a better one simply because it's a different political party in some of the Indian states. And we see this in India at the moment, across the different states where different parties are in power. Having said that, what I was saying indicating by that sentence, was the dismantling of the institutional framework of how you conduct elections, how elections are financed, the neutrality of the Election Commission of India. These are things that are institutional, and they're central, and they're national. They're systemic. And those have been dismantled, and they affect elections everywhere. And that is a recent change, and that is a national change, and it affects all states, regardless of which political party. And I think the responsibility for that cannot be dispersed across different political parties. Some political parties are more to blame for that than others.
So I'd like to bring this conversation to an end, if I could, by asking you about where things stand today. The research for this book formally ends in 2013, although, as you mentioned earlier, you have continued to spend time in these two villages, including as recently as the fall of 2019, just before the pandemic. I'd love to know what life in these two villages looks like today, right? Especially at a time when the BJP has made significant inroads in many parts of West Bengal. They did fabulously well relative to their own past experience in the 2019 national elections. They have now become, for all intents and purposes, the principal opposition at the state level. So the social imaginaries that you describe throughout the book, how have they changed in the past 7 years, say between 2014 and the present day?
I think the social imaginaries of being Muslim and how to participate in political life in India has shifted very severely. So when I was there, for instance, in Muharram, September 2019, the Muslim boys, they have this sort of little championship of stick fights. And there are teams, and there's music, and there's lots of drills, and lots of boys, lots of testosterone. And it was really quite moving because they were all wearing cricket strips of the Indian team. They were singing nationalist patriotic songs as their final sign-off numbers. And it was poignant because young Muslim men in Bengal, all the ones I've watched growing up over these last few years, their very existence is under threat at the moment. It's a very polarized. The one thing that the BJP did do in West Bengal very successfully was what it does very successfully everywhere, which is to polarize the electorate along religious lines. So in a state like West Bengal, where the proportion of the Muslim population is much higher than the national average, it is a substantial body. This is severely under threat now of how to be a Muslim. As far as farming is concerned, we know India, when you think of my friends, the farmers, the paddy farmers, India is going through an agrarian crisis. There are farmers protesting for nearly a year now outside the capital, New Delhi, and they have been ignored. So if you're a rural Muslim farmer, your chances of being heard or taken seriously or living with dignity are severely under threat. It's really going to be a test of the robustness of democratic cultures to see how much of a democracy can be preserved despite these severe challenges.
And do you think that has reduced their faith in the electoral aspects of citizenship that you described, or do you think that they still see that as a venue through which they might be able to change the status quo?
I think elections remain important. There's no question about that. The corruption of the electoral system, or the opacity of electoral funding that you and others have written about, your normal citizen doesn't see that clearly. They don't understand how the secrecy of their ballot, for instance, has been compromised by counting the votes of every machine, which is only 1,000 voters. They don't see that, but what they do see is the election as the experience of casting a vote as that leveling opportunity. And if you're treated as a second-class citizen the rest of the time, you can imagine it's even more important that you go and feel that you're equal to everyone else at that moment that you cast your vote, but also as an opportunity to vote out the parties that you don't want. And I think we are seeing that in election after election in India. The richest parties don't win always the elections.
My guest on the show this week is Mukulika Banerjee. She is a professor of social anthropology at the London School of Economics and the author of a brand new book, Cultivating Democracy, Politics and Citizenship in Agrarian India. It is a career-spanning work covering 15 years of ethnographic research in 2 villages in Bengal. Mukulika, congratulations on the book. I think it has a lot to tell us about the state of democracy, the evolution of democracy. Thanks for sharing some of your insights on the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
Grand Tamasha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. This podcast is an HT Smartcast original and is available on htsmartcast.com, India's fastest growing podcasting platform. You can also find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to rate and review. Helps others find the show more easily. For more information about the show and to find the writing we reference on this week's episode, visit our website, grandtamasha.com. Production assistance comes from Caroline Duckworth, Tim Martin is our audio engineer, and Cliff Jayapranada is our executive producer. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.
This was a Hindustan Times production brought to you by HT Smartcast.
HT Smartcast.